I'm here with Ron Keefe, brewer and proprietor of the Granite Brewery. Ron, could you spend a couple of minutes to explain to us how you make beer in the brewery?
Yes, certainly, Peter. Thank you. Well, the Granite Brewery is a traditional English ale brewery. We use all natural ingredients, two-row Canadian barley, Carastan malt and black malt, torrefied wheat, flaked barley. And what we use is a simple infusion mash system. Everything is mashed into a mash tun over the time period of about a half an hour or so. And during that process, we start converting the starches to sugar, which we'll later use in the fermentation process. So after the mash process, we let it rest in the mash tun for an hour and a half, and then transfer it to the kettle. Kettle, we bring it to a boil. Boil here for 1 hour, and hops are added in 2 stages in the boiling process. The first hops are added at the beginning of the boil. They are the bittering hops. They're in for the entire amount of the boil, and they will determine how bitter the beer will be. 5 minutes before the end of the boil, we'll add our finishing hops, or aroma hops, and of course they're going to determine the aroma of the beer, a very critical part. Irish moss is also added just before the end of the boil to help in the subtle and clarification of the wort. After the boil is finished, turn the heaters off and we'll whirlpool for 25 minutes. Turn that off, let that rest where everything, the hop trub, the proteins will settle out to the bottom of the kettle. 1 hour after the boil, we'll start the transfer to the fermenter. And we will do that through a heat exchanger, drop the temperature from 100 degrees Celsius, the boiling point, to about 20 degrees Celsius. We have to bring that down to about 20 Celsius because that's the temperature that the yeast will work at. If it's too hot, it'll kill the yeast. If it's too cold, the yeast will be dormant and won't work. 20 degrees, 22 degrees, in that range is where we want to keep, and that's where the yeast will be really working in its prime. Once the fermenter is about 2/3 full is when we actually pitch the yeast. Here at the Granite we use the Ringwood yeast. It's from the Ringwood Brewery in the south of England. Interesting about that is it really needs an open top fermenter. And unlike most breweries that have closed fermenters, ours are open top, and this yeast really thrives in that environment. When the yeast is pitched, it takes about 2.5 to 3 days to bring it to its final gravity, and at that point we'll skim yeast off, put it in a sterile bucket, and we will keep that just until the next brew, or else pitch it right into another brew. In the meantime, after the final gravity is reached, we'll drop the temperature down to about 3 or 4 degrees Celsius and let it sit at that level for about another 4 or 5 days. 1 week after the initial brew, here we will then transfer to either a conditioning tank or directly to a cask or to a keg. We fine the casks, sometimes we dry hop them, and then roll those into a walk-in cooler, let them settle out, condition, and they'll be served directly from one of those casks by hand pump right at the bar. Some of the larger volume beers that are served directly from the brewery, we transfer those from the fermenter to a large conditioning tank. Finings are added. We use isinglass finings here. Settles out quite nicely, and it's allowed to condition in that keg for 1 week. So then 2 weeks after the brew day, the beer is ready to be served. Most beers here are not filtered. After the fining, come up quite nice and bright, but we do filter 2 of our beers, the Ringwood Ale and the Summer, and they're lighter in color, a little lighter in body, and we find that the filtration really helps them, gives them a nice polish. So that's it. That brings it to, it's like I say, a 2-week process from start to finish. That's the typical cycle here at the Granite, from brew day to drinking day.
One of the items we find as a home brewer is very critical is cleanliness. And I've seen you here many occasions scrubbing down your equipment. What do you think about that?
Well, it definitely is the most important part of it. A lot of people think that brewing is just a lot of fun tasting beer and talking about beer, but you spend an awful lot of time just scrubbing and cleaning and then scrubbing and cleaning again. Everything has to be so clean, so sterile, because the yeast is a very, very tricky little microorganism, and it can go off just like that. So, and it can find dirt that you can't even see with the human eye. So you have to be very clean, you got to scrub, you have to sanitize before anything that's going to come in contact with your beer.
Okay. Thank you, Ron. We certainly appreciate the beer we get here, and we think you do a marvelous job. Thanks very much.
Cheers.
It's always such a pleasure to be here at the Granite and see Ron and see how he makes his beer. And we've got a little unfinished business of our own with some of his beer. So why don't we talk a little bit about what we're going to do with our brewing today?
I guess the first thing we have to decide, Pete, is what it is we're going to brew. What do you think about doing up a nice crisp lager?
Well, I do like a cool lager on a hot summer day, but you know, you need a cooler temperature to ferment a lager, and it's getting pretty warm out there. And right now, neither one of us really has the facilities to ferment at those sort of temperatures. So I'm kind of partial to the body, color, and bitter hoppiness of an English ale anyway. So why don't we stick to one of our English ales?
That makes sense, Pete. Why don't we do up our Pete and Doug's Session Ale? It's always a crowd pleaser.
That's right.
Here's what's going to go into our beer.
A session ale is an easy drinking beer that you might have more than one of in a session. In our beer, we use 2,400 grams of pale malt, a traditional malt for English ales, and add 500 grams of flaked maize, which we think creates a nice smoothness. We balance this with 60 grams of Fuggles hops and 25 grams of Goldings hops, both traditional English hops that add a refined bitterness to the beer. We'll need 15 liters of water for the mash, and a packet of ale yeast for the fermentation process. When we're finished, we'll have 25 liters of beer with an original or starting gravity of 1.046.
Let's preview some of the fun that's in store for us today at our brewery, sometimes known as Doug's Laundry Room. First, we're going to get all the equipment out of the cupboard so it can be thoroughly cleaned and sanitized. While Doug's getting the equipment cleaned, I'll be getting the ingredients out and ready for brewing.
We're going to use some simple and inexpensive brewing equipment that serves the same functions as Ron's equipment, but that allows us to brew up a small 20-liter or about 6 US gallon batch. We'll be following a 5-step brewing process. The first step happens in the mash tun, where we'll steep the grains for about 90 minutes in hot water. Once the mashing is completed, we'll collect the sweet liquid or wort using a process called sparging. In the third step, we'll boil the wort for about 2 hours in our boiler. It's in this third step where we'll add the hops. In the fourth step, we'll transfer the wort to the primary fermenter where we'll let it cool and then add our yeast to begin the fermentation process. The beer will stay in the primary fermenter for about 3 to 5 days, and then we'll transfer it to our secondary fermenter for about another 7 to 10 days. After that, the beer is ready to bottle, and then another 3 to 4 weeks after that, it's ready to enjoy.
Keep in mind that your brewing process is going to take you approximately 6 hours from when you take your equipment out and cleaning it till you pitch the yeast and clean up at the end of the day. I think we should finish up our business here and get to your place and do some work.
Excellent.